go in order.
I'm Marla Stone. Nancy, I had a thought that popped into my head when you asked about unity, a discourse of unity within diversity. You may see this as an anti-model, but what about the Soviet Union, right? That repressed ethnic difference in the name of the great project, the worker state. And some of this is true for Yugoslavia too. Tito did put a lid for a while on the ethnic conflict in the name of brotherhood and freedom. So
well, maybe I think it's a little bit of what Michael said. I think they use so much resources and coercive violence to keep that system together. That is, and then there was a sort of under thing going on as well. So you're right. The Soviet Union gave all this ethnic federated autonomies. Every little ethnic group, the joke is that they all had their own, national dance company. And they could have their national languages and things like that, as long as they didn't sort of rebel. Plus, they got a lot of resources from the center, and then they were prohibited from anything that was political opposition in the name of the nation. So the whole thing held together as long, I guess, as the resources flowed from the center, and enough. They had affirmative action. They had lots of policies whereby local ethnic people had a certain number of quotas in the major universities in the center, and they had, the circulation of elites between the center and the periphery. However, if there was, Professor Yuri Sloskin up at Berkeley, the Russianist up there, has a fascinating argument in which he argues that they kind of lost faith in the grand Soviet ideology of creating the Soviet man somewhere in the 40s, 50s, and then they defaulted to Russian nationalism. So the cultural norm of the Soviet Union began to be the great Russian heritage. So everybody, the school system was everybody knows their Tolstoy and their Dostoevsky. They know their Tchaikovsky. There's this myth of our country is wonderful because of the cultural achievements of the great 19th century. So they sort of stoked Russian nationalism as the default identity for the whole rest of the state, so that then it was there, ready to emerge once the Soviet Union collapsed. So yeah, maybe that system worked, but I think it worked on a lot of resource flow and a lot of coercion.
I mean, it's the same in China as well. I mean, the Stalinist model of the four factors that you have for the ethnic minorities, you give them those four, and the assumption was that you join the glorious republic, and you always had the option of opting out. Of course, there was a big asterisk next to that you really didn't have an option to get out. And of course, in China, I mean, with the Han population, of course, it's become Han nationalism, Chinese nationalism. That has exactly the same phenomenon has happened. That's pretty much what's holding it all together.
Okay, I have two questions which I guess have to do with the scope of application of these theories of empire in different directions. So one question is whether these models of empire also would apply to post-colonial imperialism of the sort that the US and China are, let's say, competing for in Latin America or Africa, where there isn't any claim of sovereignty. Because that does actually seem like a somewhat different phenomenon. And then on the other direction, this has already sort of come up. As you have defined empire, it seems to me it's kind of ambiguous whether there's actually a difference between an empire and a nation, because as you've said, nations are also diverse in a lot of ways. And if I think of the history of, let's say, Mexico or Brazil or even the Netherlands in a different way, well, they're trying to impose sovereignty over a diverse group of peoples, and the extent to which they're successful in different localities or over different groups is different. And it seems to me that in a certain way, you're talking about the same political phenomenon, the same political process as you are when you talk about what we traditionally think of as empires.
Let me start on the second question, and you can do the first question. It's a tougher one. That is an interesting thing about, the ambiguity. Are they all basically the same thing? But it seems to me that maybe, Burbank and Cooper's first model of empire, that's the more homogenizing one, in theory at least. You get Roman citizenship. You get French civilization in your empire. That might be looked at as similar to the national project of creating a single unity. But I think most historical empires were the other kind, the politics of difference kind, where there was a kind of loose ideological claim. The Russian Tsar, Orthodox, Russian-speaking, Slavic, claims to have a benevolent patrimonial authority over all his lands. It's not an ideology in which individuals can identify through their common ethnicity and common bonds, but it seemed to work enough to hold that empire together as a discourse because the Tsar offered rights to each ethnic group, each religion, on their own terms, but they all had an imperial system of rights to him. So that there's a very loose sort of connecting ideology and then a lot of local differences up until, the state defines what it wants from the locality really minimally. It's taxation, it's military recruitment, it's basic loyalty, it's resources, it's criminal law. And otherwise, they do what they want. And indigenous institutions remain. So that doesn't strike me as the same thing as the project of the modern day nation, which is supposed to sort of unify around a single everything, everybody, all same rights, same laws, popular sovereignty, all of that. And I guess it's that ethos of the politics of difference empire, leaving aside all the coercion that goes into really keeping it going. It's that ethos that we might learn something from, So Dan's other question was about no claim of sovereignty, but imperial strategies, right? Something like that. Yeah. Post-colonial imperial strategies, right?
Well, it's kind of building on what you were saying earlier. You're exactly right. Pretty much every nation state is a continuity of an empire. It's always, incorporating people. The Netherlands or Sweden or whatever, every nation state has to incorporate minorities of various kinds and how it's dealt with. And it's pretty much the continuity of the imperial model. I don't know if the three models that were suggested are all of them. French colonialism in North Africa was very different than the German colonialism in Namibia. If you were an Algerian, you were French. And the understandings were very different, and the consequences and the structures were different of how it was conceptualized. Again, but on the post-colonial issue, I frankly say I don't have an answer. I think the largest problem is that nobody wants to say that they are an empire now. Empire, of course, has a negative ring to it, unless you're Neil Ferguson and John Gaddis or whatever, who think empire is great and that's what we should be doing. And so I think that's the largest problem. It's like nobody is recognizing this, and so how do you even talk about it? And I think that needs to be addressed.
What do you make of? We were talking in conversation the other day. Do you mind if I raise this issue that you raised of corporate empire, that is the global power of economic institutions, businesses, international monetary funds and things like that? Would you call that a kind of post-colonial imperial?
Yeah, this is my own, the stuff that I'm working on now here. Is this idea of, the state or the nation state is a fading entity in a certain sense, even though everybody wants to hold on to it. But empire and imperial models have now, as I kind of hinted at with my pointing out to the Southeast Asian example, I'm thinking of empires like the Srivijaya and Mahaprajapit, in the early medieval period. These were, very diffuse, decentralized empires, but and they did it all through these massive trading networks. And so, you think of like multinationals, IMF, World Bank, or these institutions that are not part of state institutions, but they're obviously working within World Bank. The example I talked about with China going into Congo and saying, give us 10 million tons of copper ore and we'll give you $9 billion for infrastructure. That deal was actually stopped by the World Bank. Of course, with America standing in the background saying, this is our territory. So these institutions that are not state-bound, in a certain sense, are being used to drive imperial policy. So I think, if you're going to talk about, this is my own term of corporate imperialism, this is another way of conceptualizing how this has changed in the post-colonial period. It is multinationals, it is these institutional structures, the UN or whatever, that is driving imperialist policy. Again, but nobody wants to use that term.
So we had Bethany.
Thanks. I'm Bethany. Johan, you referred to fear and the role that it plays in empirical rule, and you referred to the role of legitimacy, Nancy. And I'm wondering about the relationship between those two and how that relationship changes over the duration of empirical rule. So my naive perception would be that fear may play a very important part of establishing legitimacy initially, but that over time it'd be critical that the fear diminishes and things like the allocation of resources that you talked about plays a more central role. But I am not a historian, so I'd be interested in hearing about what that relationship typically looks like if you see more successful examples of empirical rule.
It seems when you're saying fear, it reminds me of there's another polarity, a binary opposition that we didn't mention, but that I've encountered a lot amongst historians, is that tends to be a tendency amongst historians who either emphasize the degree of violence that is necessary to create and maintain an empire, the degree of subverting and subjugating people, versus the people who talk about this sort of wild and woolly local politics on its own, sort of under the light hand of the center. There tends to be people prefer one or the other approach. But I think that we shouldn't, and my presentation probably underplayed the violence aspect, because in the end, the imperial power maintains power because it can knock heads together. It can put down a small uprising. It can recruit people into the army. It can be a violent, coercive. And so it's always there. It's worse in the beginning. Then the threat of it is usually sufficient, or can be very enduringly sufficient to maintain. So then the issue of legitimacy, I must say, I'm not sure the Russian Empire spent a lot of time worrying about whether it was a legitimate state because it had the power. Perceived, yeah. And I think my friend Jane Burbank, who co-authored this book, also has a very important article in Russian history called An Imperial Regime of Rights, which I just referred to. She argues that, I'm not sure she used the term legitimacy, she might, that the Russian Empire was stable from the 16th century to 1917 or 1991, however you want to date it, because it offered an imperial system of rights. That is, it divided everybody up by ethnicity or religion, language group, whatever. Everybody might have had one or two dominant identities, their religion plus their Polish or Ukrainian or Lithuanian or Uzbek or whatever identity. And then each one of those groups had a different relationship but had the right to call on the imperial center for protection, benefits, resources, etc. So there's a zillion different law codes and a zillion different norms about marriage and divorce, and all these things are different depending upon sort of what your identity is. But it worked because everybody sort of got satisfied individually. It's also a divide and conquer strategy. And so to the point that the Imperial Center provides everybody, my colleague in the history department, Bob Cruz, has a big fat book called For Prophet and Tsar, about the Imperial Russian Empire's interaction and conquests of the Muslims of the empire over 200 years, and he argues that the stability was immensely stable. There are more Muslims in the Russian Empire than in the Middle East, and that there was never a major uprising until 1905 and 1917 because the center satisfied local norms. So that's, I guess, legitimacy in a sense, and the legitimacy is defined by diversity in a funny way. So, do you have?
Well, on the Muslims, they basically let the Muslims run their own affairs. The sheikhs were doing, or the cheddis were doing the legal institutions, and the local Khan or whoever it was allowed to do whatever they were. So legitimacy was accepted, and it was extremely successful in that case. And in other areas, it has been less successful. I guess you could point it to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Bob has some examples of venue hopping where Muslims would go from their local Sharia law courts to the Russian courts with the same case, hoping that they'd get a better deal from, the Russian court than from the Sharia, one. So it's an example, and that's what historians are interested in nowadays. Bottom up, how do people use the system for their own benefits? So,
I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on the role of the spread of religion as an adjunct to national imperial projects. Clearly, there's a substantial claim that missionaries play an important role in the process of imperial extension. And one could argue that perhaps the religious faith groups themselves, their leadership might have an independent imperial project. If one thinks about, for example, the role of the Catholic Church in Latin America. And you made mention of adaptations to local norms and practices. And so clearly the way in which Catholicism is practiced in parts of Latin America incorporates preceding religious practices that existed in those communities. So I was just trying to think of if you might reflect on how religion plays into this process. And the other question I had is, what's the relationship between imperialism and colonialism? We typically use those terms separately, but are they really ultimately the same thing? And is there any utility to thinking about them as being conceptually distinct? Final observation is kind of a minor point, which is I think we ought to be careful when we're talking about specific examples or sites to maintain the same units of analysis. When we were talking about sites of genocidal violence, Africa collectively was cited as the location, but clearly it's specific locations or specific countries in Africa. And the other two examples were also countries, not continents. So, yeah.
Point taken. Go, please. Yeah.
I'll start with the religion question, and yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, historically, the movement of missionaries has been, intrinsically tied to spread of imperial power. And I mean, again, I would also connect into this corporate imperialism that I was talking about. I mean, missionaries are going out, not just to spread the gospel, but also to basically extract resources and send it back to the center. I mean, you can look at like the expansion of the caliphate. I mean, that's probably one of the greatest examples of it. I mean, the success of Islam was tied into, first they knocked down the Sassanid and Byzantine empires and basically took all the gold and silver that they had hoarded over the previous 5 centuries and then created a unified currency, the dinar and the dirham, and they controlled trade over 3 continents in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. It's the first time that it had ever happened, all under the glorious banner of Islam. But I mean, it was very much a corporate imperialist project. I mean, and this is the same. You could do it with the Catholic, you could do it with Buddhism, you could do it with Hinduism as it spread into Southeast Asia and spread. Shelley Pollack has the great term, the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which unified the Khmer Empire and Angkor and all the rest of it, based on Hindu theories of Brahmanic kingship. So yes, the short answer is that religious the missionaries are certainly spread into it. I mean, and so going to come back to Dan's question, I mean, a lot of people now are looking at the spread of Pentecostals in Africa and in Latin America, and how does that tie into the spread of American culture? They're very much intertwined.
Mm-hmm. On religion, though, it doesn't have to work that way because the Russian imperial state, tamped down the enthusiasm of the Russian Orthodox Church for missionary activity. And it's not a very missionizing church compared to the Catholic Church. It sees as a church, Russian Orthodoxy itself is more interested in sort of contemplative prayer than it is in external social work. But even as much as it wanted to do missionizing missions, the Imperial Center told it not to do conversion campaigns, and they sort of waxed and waned in Russian history when occasionally they would do all these forced conversions in Siberia and the Tataria, and then the next decade or so, the Tsars would say, "Oh no, that's too counterproductive, back off," and they often had the rules in the Russian Empire were that the native peoples paid higher taxes than the Orthodox peoples did. So if you converted somebody, they lost tax revenue. So they didn't have a strong homogenizing emphasis around religion in that particular empire. So it can work either way.
I'm wondering if it's possible to draw you out a little bit on the trajectory of the relationship between empire and nation. Johan, you had said that one of the questions facing studies of empires is, when does an empire decide to become a nation? That surprised me, because I would have thought it the opposite way around. When does a nation think to...
I don't think that's quite what I said, but I mean, it was...
Oh, okay. How does an empire become a nation state?
Yeah.
Okay, at any rate,
but
my question...
It's the nation that's thinking back upon it, you know.
Well, so that's my question, because it seems to me that we have so many examples following what Dan had suggested of nation states behaving in part like empires, and I'm thinking particularly in the Middle East. So I wonder, other than the economic circumstances, which you had mentioned, Nancy, are relevant to when an empire gets formed, are there other circumstances that might be worth delineating?
Well, the Middle East is all of those nations that are drawn in the sand, so to speak, are the legacy of European powers. I mean, and so they themselves are a legacy of the colonial experience. And and America, yeah. I mean, and so so they're dealing with contradictions that were created by people sitting in Paris, and of course we're dealing with the consequences of that. But I mean, and then of course they have to rationalize, how is that? You know, what is Iraq? What is Iran? You know, I mean, and they have to come up with those terms, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And of course those are in contradictions. It's the same in China. It's the same in Africa. You know, what is Kenya? You know, why is that there on the map? Who's going to be running the show? Some people who look at the historians of the Africans, many of the nations, which we're talking, the religious aspect of this, which groups within these artificial boundaries became most powerful. I mean, and one historian has pointed out that the groups that became most powerful were the first ones who had the Bible translated into their own language. And they were the ones who adopted these models out of the European system, and they basically became dominant. And of course, these are the Hutu and Tutsi and all these other Asian, the Belgian legacy or whatever. I mean, so this is this shift is nothing unique. I mean, I think this is the phenomenon that happens in all of these.
My name is Bill Roy. This follows up on that, and it has to do more with the relationship of empire and states. That there's a literature that looks at states as sort of like empires, but they also have nations. There's another literature that looks at states as particular configurations of governance that are involved with specific kinds of extracting resources, specific kinds of legal systems, and sort of puts the issue of nationhood or homogeneity, as Nancy was talking about it, as secondary. But you've been talking about empires mostly in terms of the overriding question is its relationship to nations. So the question is, are there particular kinds of governance, particular kinds of modes of extraction, particular kinds of bureaucratic organization that are consistent across empires? Or is that in some sense just sort of an incidental question about them?
Well, I think those three models would talk about differences of the bureaucratic structures.
Yeah, but I think a lot of interesting work is exactly on that sort of thing, like the governance modes. How do you actually connect with the locals? And there's a lot of study on how you co-opt elites. How you enlist them with land grants or offices, how you bring them to the imperial center, you give them Russian nobility. If you label them princes and barons and dukes or that sort of thing historically. So I think that there's a lot of work from the imperial center on cultivating at least that elite that you need. And historical sociologists will tell you that if you've got your elite, you don't really need your peasants, because the elite is what will keep the peasants down. I'm thinking Giddens and Michael Mann and people like that. And the other thing about bureaucracy, I'm sure in communications there's a huge literature on this. I've just been reading one of Dan's colleagues' works on bureaucratic paperwork from this center. And I'll tell you what fascinated me when I started thinking about this, doing my own research on 17th and 18th century Russia, which was that the legal cases that go from the center to the periphery, so the center would have oversight on capital cases, and the format of the documentation was very particularly written. It was written in a ridiculously, to our modern eyes, repetitive fashion, so that the local government would write, "We just arrested a man who confessed after 3 sessions of torture to murder. Now what do I do with him?" And then they would write back and say, "You wrote to us on such a day that you just blah, blah, blah." They repeat the whole thing he just sent and then give an order. And then they say, "Do more torture to find out if he has accomplices." So then the governor will write, "I wrote to you on such a day, blah, 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 blah. You wrote back, blah, blah, blah. And I did the 3 more sessions of torture, and he has no accomplices. Now what do I do?" And so he sends it to Moscow. Moscow writes back, repeats the whole thing. So this thing is getting longer and longer and longer, and it's this incredibly repetitive paperwork. And it's very consistent across the 17th and 18th centuries. And, historians have tended to kind of, hee, aren't they silly? They're wasting all this paper. But what I think is going on there is a kind of teaching model. That is, the center is teaching the local governors, who are amateurs, here's legal procedure. Here's how you do it. It's also, they change because of the other strategy I was talking about, they change their governors once every 1 or 2 years so that they won't become little satraps locally. So they won't remember the beginning of the murder case. So this, repetition will tell them, here's the history of your case, now do something. So I've been asking my early modern colleagues if their documentation looks like this. I have an Ottoman colleague who says theirs does look repetitive like this. Probably in the modern day it's not quite so necessary, but there is a certain necessity of the center to use paperwork, to teach, to control, to communicate to the locals that way. So I'm sure bureaucracy is a fertile ground of imperial control, and how you file paperwork and what you keep and how you. This article by Dan's colleague was all about how different experts would add to the dossiers on a certain issue. So the scientific experts would add something that the nobles had already written, and then you would get this multiplicity of voices in one bureaucratic document.
I mean, in that case, the Chinese documents are the same. This massive repetition of everything again and again and again. It's the same in India. Chris Bailey, the Information Empire, looks at, it's the same in the Raj as well.
So I'm Emily Ozer, and I wanted to hear a little bit more, Johan, about the corporate imperialism, and also thinking about the term, cultural imperialism is a term that's been used a lot, particularly in relation to the U.S. And it just seems like in some ways, the coercion is more subtle because it's sort of social and psychological about, so images and movies and clothing and, in what ways that sort of the values kind of get transmitted through these, through marketing and through exposure of, that sort of undermines some of the, or perceived to undermine the values of a lot of other different countries. And it makes me think of Coke in the sense that, it fits this sort of imperial model in the sense of using local water, but has maintains the secret recipe and sort of using the local distribution networks. And so just here maybe a little bit more in what ways is it useful to think about these corporations as the empire builders, and then sort of that the military and political forces kind of follow along to sort of run cover for the corporations.
To be honest, I'm still working this out. So this is just, stuff that I'm working on now, so I don't have a pat answer. But, I think pretty much all of the things you're talking about. Like Nancy was talking about, how do you promote legitimacy and visual culture and all of these other things, American culture is everywhere. You go to China, you go to Africa, whatever. People are wearing the same clothes, listening to rap and, drinking Coca-Cola. But, is it, how does that promote the American agenda? Of course it promotes the American agenda. And so, the way I'm thinking about it is, how, I'm looking at it historically, but how do these contemporary phenomenon, how can it be used? Again, this idea as a corporate system in the pre-modern period is what I'm looking at. So using exactly, as you say, all these visual cultures, cultural imperialism, and the corporate structure as a model to conceptualize how empire, religion, whatever, spread around the world. So again, it's very in the preliminary stage, and so sorry I don't have a more coherent answer.